So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to come to Tallinn for the first time in my case. And I was intrigued by the tale of the very cold place that you were in 1998, a generation ago. I'm very glad that the gas bills have been paid between then and now, because if it hadn't been, I wouldn't be here. I feel the cold. I come from London. It's a very tropical place by comparison. So I'm very glad to be here. Thank you very much for your hospitality. I would like to introduce this talk by making a couple of observations. And in fact, they were prefaced by the moderator as she introduced the conference. And it's to ask you to have a distinction in your mind between the integration challenge generally and the integration challenge specifically. Now, we already have heard and we already know that Estonia has its own particular interpretation of integration, particularly in the context of its neighbourhood and its neighbours. Just in the last generation, there are all sorts of issues that one can focus upon, and indeed people will focus upon in this conference and in previous conferences. But as the moderator pointed out, between then and now, when this first event effectively took place, the world has changed enormously. And one aspect of that world has been the phenomena of global migration. There are very many rich and middle income countries that are experiencing significant levels of migration. And they're experiencing them both for common but also sometimes specific reasons. And one byproduct of that migration has been the arrival and settlement of communities that can feel very different. So when you add all these countries together, and I think Estonia probably fits in the middle of this, there ends up being, I suppose, three high-level questions, ones that we've already talked about but have been preoccupying us for many, many years, and they boil down to the following. The first is a general question, which is, are they, the newcomers, like us? You can fill in that any way you want. You can answer that anyway, but it's a question of comparison. In what way are they like us, and what way are they not like us? They're humans, so they're like us, but they may speak different languages, so they're not like us, and so on and so forth. A second question related to that could be, in what ways could they become like us? So they might go to the same schools, they might speak the same language, and so on and so forth. And then there's a third question, and it has to do with the opening up of the us question. Indeed, if they are to become us, what is us? Indeed, who are we? And that sort of opens the door to a discussion about integration as being about changing identity and changing communities and indeed nations all over the world. So my observation at the start of this, before I go into this, is to point out that there is always a danger with starting on questions of fear. Most countries in the world are experiencing some aspect of fear, either in terms of the scale of migration, or the composition, or indeed some of the flashpoints, some of the anger, some of the violence, some of the appetite for violence that goes with that. So I think we've got to be very careful when we start with a discussion of fear. But I'm going to do that anyhow, so I'm prefacing what I've got to say in that regard. But for integration more generally, and we are only looking now in this session at the sort of extreme end of failure when things go very badly wrong, there have always been, in my view, three or four, as it were, laboratories of integration. There are three or four places you can look to answer these questions that I was mentioning earlier on. Are they like us? Could they become like us? Who are we? One is the arena of economics, and in particular the labour market. Many of these countries have migrant populations and settled second, third generation communities who, if you look at the profile of their labour market participation, the migrants and the minorities tend to have very different labour market participation patterns, not just rates. But essentially it's a question of economics. In the labour market can be a place in which integration can take place, where the workplace becomes integrated. made up of people from different backgrounds. And at the end of that labour market integration, there is a very simple test one has in one's mind, and it was given to me many years ago by the Canadian ambassador to the High Commissioner to London. And he boasted, it wasn't quite true, but he boasted that in Canada, after one generation, after the passage of one generation, 25 years, every immigrant minority went on to have more or less the same labour market achievements as native born. So from a statistical point of view, you couldn't tell the difference. They were like us after one generation. So it's a very simple way of looking at integration. It's economics. A second arena of integration can be not so much that, but it can be education. What happens in the school playground, not the workplace. People being taught together. But another very simple measure of that, if you think about it, would be educational attainment. Is there a penalty or is there a premium that's enjoyed by immigrants and their kids in particular? And that changes. Some of these countries now, once upon a time, had immigrant penalties, and some of them are now reporting immigrant premiums, where migrants and their kids outperform some of the native born. And so on and so forth. But many other labour market, integration laboratories can include things like housing, very contentious, the neighbourhood, who lives with us, never mind who is educated with our kids, but who lives with us. And beyond that, we can go into a very, in a more softer realm, I suppose, which are our friendship networks. These things can be measured. They are measured very thoroughly nowadays. And you can go all the way through to the hierarchy of your friends, your neighbours, your workplace colleagues, your boss, your in-law. I mean, I can carry on, okay? But I mean, you can see what I'm trying to get at. There are many different places you can measure these things, and they may not always tell us the same thing. But I think it's worth having a look at all of them. Enough of the preface. Let me just talk a little bit about this. So I was, oops, I could have pointed that way. There we go. So these three things I want to talk about. Very simply, I want to focus upon, as I said earlier on, an area where there is failure and where things have gone wrong. Now, I come from a country that has tremendous experience of things going very successfully, but also things going wrong. We can have, as it were, pool both experiences. But we have to confront the fact that in the last 10 years, in particular, there has been significant examples of radicalization and extremism in the United Kingdom. Can I just skip to, well, let me just get to the point. This is really what I want you to focus upon. It's a very simple, boiled-down diagram. One or two of you may recognize the antecedents, the pedigree of this. The diagram on the left, is there a, I won't press anything. The diagram on the left, it's a very simple model. Let's call it Model 1. And it can be applied to extremism and indeed radicalization of any kind. Not just that comes from some parts of immigration. And what it's referring to, of course, is that the appetite for violence, for hatred, let's call this group the men of violence. They tend to be more men than women, incidentally, who actively engage in conspiracies of violence. When we study them, and remember we have to study them indirectly when the plots emerge, when law enforcement is able to detect this. It's not as if I know, it's not that we actually know. But the men of violence are represented by the red dot in the middle of the left-hand diagram. In the United Kingdom, if you want to know, when we measure this, that ends up being about anywhere between 1,200 and 1,800 individuals. Why do I know that? Because those are the numbers that we've officially put out in the public domain of the men of violence, who this morning we are actively following. We know where they are. We know indeed who they are. We just don't know what they're going to do. But we have reason to believe, on an intelligence basis, that these are active conspiracies. Of course, the green surrounding the red in the left-hand diagram refers to everyone else in the communities that breed or have bred some of this extremism and radicalization. So it's a simple model. It's inviting you to think of violence as being an exceptional activity. If it's 1,800 people, It must follow that the Green in the United Kingdom, referring to Britain's settled Muslim minority population, is in excess of 2 million people. That's the arithmetic. So I'm inviting you to think of 2 million people, or thereabouts, who are law-abiding, like you, like me, and a small group who are the men of violence in the middle. 2,000 at most. If you do your maths very quickly, you can see it's a very, very small fraction. And of course, the point I'm making is that would be wonderful. Don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating, but I'm trying to point out that that would be an ideal model to deal with extremism and the appetite for violence. Why? Because there's a sharp distinction between the good guys and everyone else. But what I'm going to invite you to think about would be the potential of the right-hand diagram. Switching. And in the right-hand diagram, to simplify, I'm just pointing, and these are not drawn proportionately, these circles. I mean, these are just to illustrate the point. But now we have 3 concentric circles. Men of violence, law-abiding majority, and in between, well, you can call them what you want. I mean, different countries, funny enough, have different terms to refer to this in-between group. And it's a group that emerges every time we've looked at violence, particularly in rich, developed societies. In fact, this model was essentially developed in our studies of Northern Ireland, first of all, Basque separatism, Quebecois in Canada, to name 3 examples that have nothing to do with modern Islamic populations in the West. And they are an in-between group. In Northern Ireland, they became known as the sneaking regarders. I don't expect the translation to work, by the way. It doesn't work, doesn't matter. But it's referring, if I can use my own language, it refers to people who are caught in between, who turn a blind eye, who know that there is an appetite for violence, who know that there are active plots, but who are caught in that position. And for successful policy to intervene, particularly security policy, not communities policy, we must accept that people to some extent will be caught in that in-between world. That they recognize that there is a threat, but they find it difficult to act upon that. But let me move on and try to provide some of the explanation very quickly. Oops, I keep on pointing. Let me point that towards you. And what I've done here very quickly in the interest of time is to say, well, here's some of the things that we don't really know, given what I said a moment ago. Well, let me just pick on 2 or 3 of these things. The first is that actually, when you look at the literature, we have very, very little understanding of what creates a collective identity in this particular religious minority group. It could be another group. The things that bind this together, particularly in a politicized sense. We understand people's identity as a member of a religious group, but what we don't understand is the way in which that is bound together, never mind in a political sense. Second of all, a lot of this is subjective, not objective. It might be attractive to say, well, let's look at the integration indicators of this group. All these groups, by the way, these communities. And those are objective indicators. Their school attainment scores, their labour market progression rates, their housing patterns. These things can be objectively measured. But many of the grievances that we're describing here, of course, are very subjectively felt. So in terms of analysing and explaining this, there's a real disjuncture between the objective and the subjective. And thirdly, there is a real concern that we are dealing with Newtonian principles, that things have simple causes and effects. There's a simple narrative that exclusion or marginalisation leads to an appetite for violence. Indeed, it's far from that. Well, let me just briefly pause on this. It's what I call the distinction between violent and non-violent extremism. Well, the first thing it reminds you of course, is to think a little bit about what is the nature of non-violent extremism of any kind. How do we tolerate, how do we accommodate, how do we think about dissent? These are mostly democracies, some of them advanced liberal democracies, some of them young liberal democracies, but they all have mechanisms for dealing with the question of dissent. We call it political dissent, ideological, people who dissent from governing parties, governing coalitions, people who have just some dissent. But second of all, what I've described as this blue group that I mentioned earlier on, the in-between group, what I call, let's say, fence sitters. They sit on a fence. It's difficult for them to know how. I describe this as indeed being part of the human condition. Humans have a habit of turning a blind eye, of turning the other way. And indeed, when we study this in detail, a lot of this is based upon survey evidence that asks about people's degree of sympathy for men of violence, towards men of violence. And we find time and time again that people are identifying with that grievance. But does that mean they're actively condoning it? For them to actively condone the violence, it seems to me that they would be guilty indeed of providing what I describe as the moral oxygen, the excuse, the rationale, the reason why men of violence believe that they have an entire community, an entire group behind them. Anyhow, in the interest of time, let me just quickly move on and finish with this. The picture on the right is a real-time picture of men of violence, sadly. This is Mohammed Sadiq Khan and his co-conspirators on the morning of the 7th of July 2005, getting on at a train station near London and about to engage in the most spectacular form of violence we've seen in recent terrorism in the United Kingdom. This was not detected by intelligence sufficiently well enough for us to prevent it. So, given the difficulty of all this, we have an audience here. People are from broadly what I described as the policy community, or maybe the policy network. People who are intellectuals, people who are practitioners, people who hold elective office. But all of us ultimately must reduce our analysis and our thoughts to the very simple question of what should be done, and indeed what can be done. So all I'm inviting you to think about here is what can be done. And ultimately it seems to me that legitimate democratic governments can only do three things, one of three things, or a combination of three things. The first, in public policy terms, is that we can use authority. We can establish rules, and a rules-based approach to public policy is a very familiar one. We use it in many different aspects of our lives to deal with harm, and harm that we want to avoid or we want to minimize. But the point about a rules-based approach is that it must also be accompanied by a fairly vigilant degree of monitoring and enforcement. We must know who is following the rules and who's not, who's breaching and who's not breaching. And then once we've deciphered which rules are being followed to what extent, we must have a regime of enforcement, including punishment. So we must think in proportional terms. So people who break the speed limit, how much do we condone that? Well, maybe moderately, a little bit. But if people who are serial offenders, who drive at excessive speed, maybe with alcohol in their blood and so on and so forth, we think of a regime of enforcement, punishment. So authority is one thing that we can use. And you can see straight away that authority has its role, particularly around security. But in terms of engaging these communities, I suspect authority is a twin-edged sword. It comes with a downside as well, particularly when we think about monitoring. You think about monitoring quickly becoming surveillance of one kind or another. The second thing you can do, if your appetite for authority is limited, is that we can engage in transactional activities, where we think about outputs, indeed outcomes, but particularly outputs, in advance, and that we think of ways of rewarding these things. We hold people to account for them. We may incentivize this. We may provide inducements. But transactional doesn't require people to buy into your objectives to any greater extent than the outputs that you specify in advance. And then lastly, the weakest link in this, I suppose, is persuasional. That we provide information, we provide advice, we provide support. And we expect people to moderate their behavior in such a way that they take account of the objectives that we pre-specify. Well, in all of this, I'll just finish by pointing out that there is a danger of a boomerang. So in translation, a boomerang, of course, is thank you from Australia. And in public policy, we often think about the virtue, I won't throw this, but the virtue of having a targeted approach, a slingshot. So if the harm at the back of this room is represented by the camera, and I use my policy instrument, the whole point is to hit the camera in one go, as a symbolic way of describing surgical accuracy and precision. Well, how often do we manage that? The number of times, frankly, we narrowly miss the camera. And not only do we start with one problem, but of course this comes spinning around the room and ends up hitting not just me on the head, but my colleagues on the panel as well. That, it seems to me, is you start with one problem and then you end up with 2 or 3, even before you've achieved any good. I'll finish there, but I just wanted to begin by identifying some of the traps and difficulties of operating in a situation of extreme failure where there is an appetite for violence. Thank you.